Rich CEO takes humble girl 10 years younger to his ex's wedding, but can't stop staring at her. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The ivory envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, sliding across Easton Reed's mahogany desk like a ghost from his past. His assistant Miranda had placed it precisely between his morning coffee and the quarterly financial reports. But somehow the elegant script on the front commanded all his attention. Mr. Easton Reed and guest. He didn't need to open it to know what it contained. Brittany's wedding announcement had been splashed across every society page in Manhattan for months. The merger of two pharmaceutical dynasties, they called it. A fairy tale romance between his former fiancée and Marcus Hartwell, the man who'd stolen both his largest client and the woman he'd planned to marry. Easton's fingers traced the embossed edge of the invitation without opening it. 5 years had passed since Brittany walked out of their engagement party with Marcus's arm around her waist. 5 years since she'd looked him in the eye and said, "You love your company more than you could ever love me, Easton. Marcus sees me as more than just another acquisition." The words had cut deep because they carried the sting of truth. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Reed, the Morrison Industries team is here for your 10 o'clock. Easton slid the invitation into his desk drawer, unopened. "Send them in." The morning passed in a blur of presentations and profit margins, but the ivory envelope haunted him. During lunch, eaten alone at his desk as always, he finally opened it. The wedding was set for Saturday evening at the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom, black tie, reception to follow. Mr. Easton Reed and guest. He laughed, but there was no humor in it, guest, as if he'd maintained any semblance of a social life since Brittany left. His days began at 6 a.m. and ended well past midnight, 7 days a week. Reed Enterprises had grown into a pharmaceutical empire worth $3 billion under his obsessive leadership. But his personal life had withered to nothing. Who would he bring? His last relationship had ended 18 months ago when Sarah finally stopped pretending she could compete with his company for his attention. Before that, there had been Jennifer, who'd lasted 6 months before giving him the same ultimatum Brittany had. Choose work or choose love. He'd chosen work every time. The afternoon brought another wave of meetings, but his mind kept drifting to the invitation. By 5 o'clock, most of his staff had gone home to their families, their real lives, while Easton remained in his glass tower, reviewing contracts under the harsh fluorescent lights. The building had grown quiet around him when he finally made the decision. He wouldn't go. There was no point in subjecting himself to the spectacle of Brittany's happiness, to the pitying looks of Manhattan's elite who'd watched his relationship crumble in real time. But as he prepared to throw the invitation away, something stopped him. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe, after 5 years of burying himself in work, he was finally ready to face the past he'd been running from. His phone buzzed with a text from his brother Jake. Saw the engagement announcement in the Times. "You okay?" Easton stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Fine, just busy. You're always busy." When's the last time you left that office before midnight? He couldn't remember. Days blended into nights, weeks into months, marked only by the rhythm of board meetings and earnings calls. When had his life become so small? The city sparkled below his window, 40 stories down. Millions of people were out there, living their lives, falling in love, taking chances. And here he sat, alone in his empire of glass and steel, too afraid to venture beyond the walls he'd built around himself. His fingers found the invitation again. Maybe going would provide closure. Maybe seeing Brittany happy would finally allow him to move forward. Or maybe he was just tired of being alone. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. He would go. But he wouldn't go alone. wouldn't give Brittany and Marcus the satisfaction of seeing him isolated and defeated. He'd find someone to accompany him, someone who could help him navigate the evening with dignity intact. The only question was who. Easton closed his laptop and gathered his coat. For the first time in months, he was leaving the office before midnight. Tomorrow, he'd figure out how to find a date for his ex-fiancee's wedding. Tonight, he just needed to go home and convince himself this wasn't the worst idea he'd ever had. 3 days later, Easton found himself standing outside Grind Coffee, a small cafe 6 blocks from his office building. He'd never set foot inside the place before. His assistant typically handled his caffeine needs, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The interior was nothing like the sterile corporate environments he frequented. Mismatched furniture, local artwork on exposed brick walls, and the rich aroma of freshly ground beans created an atmosphere that was both chaotic and somehow comforting. Students hunched over laptops while young professionals chatted over lattes, creating a gentle buzz of conversation that felt foreign after the aggressive silence of boardrooms. "What can I get started for you?" The voice belonged to a woman behind the counter, and when Easton looked up from the menu board, his prepared order died on his lips. She was beautiful, but not in the polished, artificial way of the women who typically move through his social circles. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, revealing a face free of the heavy makeup that seemed mandatory at Manhattan charity galas. When she smiled, it reached her eyes, genuine warmth that caught him off guard. He cleared his throat. "Large black coffee, please." "You sure about that?" She tilted her head, studying him with interest rather than the calculating looks he was used to receiving. "You look like someone who might enjoy our Honduras single origin. Complex, sophisticated, but not bitter. Are you analyzing my coffee preferences or my personality?" She laughed, and the sound was natural, unguarded. "Maybe both. I'm Kayla, by the way, and you're wearing a suit that costs more than my rent. So you're either a lawyer who prosecutes coffee shops or someone who desperately needs better coffee in his life." "Easton," he said, surprised by her directness. "And I'm neither a lawyer nor particularly desperate. Everyone's desperate for something." She began preparing his drink with practiced efficiency. "The question is whether they're brave enough to admit it." He watched her work, noting the easy confidence in her movements, the way she handled each step of the process with obvious care. "How long have you worked here?" 2 years. Saved up enough to buy in as a partner last month." Pride colored her voice. "It's not much, but it's mine. Partnership in a coffee shop." He didn't mean it to sound dismissive, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Let me guess, you're one of those guys who measures success only in zeros on a bank statement." The accuracy of her assessment stung. "That's a rather quick judgment." "Is it wrong?" She slid his coffee across the counter, their fingers brushing briefly as he reached for it. The contact was electric, unexpected. "No," he admitted after a moment, "it's not wrong." Something shifted in her expression, the defensive edge softening. "I wasn't trying to insult you. It's just, I've served enough guys in expensive suits to recognize the type. All business, no life. Maybe some of us prefer it that way. Do you?" The question was gentle but pointed. "Really prefer it?" He sipped the coffee to buy time. It was excellent, rich, complex, with subtle notes he couldn't identify. "Oh, this is very good. You're changing the subject. I'm being polite." "Politeness is overrated." She leaned against the counter, chin propped on her hand. "When's the last time you did something just for fun?" The question hung between them, and Easton realized he couldn't answer it. When had fun become such a foreign concept? "I should go." "Wait." The word came out quickly, surprising them both. "Sorry, I don't mean to pry. It's just, you seem lonely. The observation hit closer to home than he cared to admit. I have a very full life. Full of what, though? Her brown eyes held genuine curiosity, not judgment. Meetings, contracts, things that matter to your wallet, but not your heart. You don't know anything about me. No, but I know that look. I see it in the mirror sometimes. She straightened, suddenly self-conscious. Look, ignore me. I have a tendency to overstep. It's a character flaw. What look? The one that says you're successful at everything except being happy. The words lingered as other customers entered, demanding her attention. Easton found himself reluctant to leave, fascinated by this woman who saw through his carefully constructed facade with embarrassing ease. "Same time tomorrow?" she called as he headed for the door. He paused, hand on the door handle. "Maybe." Her smile was brilliant. "And I'll take maybe." Outside, Manhattan's chaos seemed louder, more jarring after the cafe's warmth. Easton walked back to his office with Kayla's words echoing in his mind. Successful at everything except being happy. The truth of it followed him all the way to the 40th floor. Easton returned to grind coffee the next afternoon, telling himself it was simply convenient. The truth was more complicated. Something about Kayla Stewart had gotten under his skin. Her directness, her authenticity, the way she'd seen straight through him with alarming precision. "Honduras, single origin again?" she asked when he approached the counter, her smile immediate and genuine. "You remembered." "I remember all my regulars." She began preparing his drink with the same careful attention as before. "Though technically, you're not a regular yet. 2 visits don't make a pattern." "What makes a pattern?" "Consistency. Showing up even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable." She glanced up at him. "Speaking of uncomfortable, you look like someone carrying around a difficult decision." He'd been wrestling with the wedding invitation for days, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle with missing pieces. The logical choice was to skip it entirely, but something held him back. Pride, curiosity, or maybe just the need to finally close that chapter of his life. "Hypothetically," he said, accepting his coffee, "if someone needed a date for a social function, are you asking me out?" The question was direct, but her tone held more amusement than shock. "No, maybe. It's complicated." Kayla leaned against the counter, studying him with those perceptive brown eyes. "Complicated how?" "It's my ex-fiancé's wedding." Her eyebrows rose. "And you want to go? Why exactly?" "I'm not sure I do want to go. But the invitation specified and guest, and I don't want to show up alone, looking like the pathetic ex who never moved on." "Have you moved on?" The question cut straight to the heart of it. Had he moved on, or had he simply buried himself so deep in work that he'd avoided dealing with the aftermath of Brittany's betrayal? "I thought I had." "But now you're not sure?" "Now I'm not sure about anything." The admission surprised him. He wasn't used to such honesty, especially with someone he barely knew. "When's the wedding?" "Saturday, Plaza Hotel." She whistled softly. "Fancy? Let me guess. She married someone richer than you." "Not richer, more focused on her than on business." The words tasted bitter. At least, that's what she claimed when she left me for him. Was she right? Another uncomfortable truth. Probably. Kayla was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Around them, the cafe's afternoon crowd created a comfortable background hum of conversation and clinking cups. "So you want a fake girlfriend for the evening?" she said finally. "Someone to smile prettily on your arm and make your ex jealous?" "That's not—" He stopped, realizing she was exactly right. "Yes, that's exactly what I want." "At least you're honest about it." She poured herself a cup of coffee. clearly thinking it over. "What's in it for me? Money?" The answer came automatically, his usual solution to everything. Her expression cooled. "Excuse me, I'd pay you, of course. For your time, address, whatever you need." "Stop." The word was sharp enough to cut. "Just stop." He'd offended her, though he wasn't sure how. "I didn't mean to." "You want to hire me to be your escort for the evening?" Her voice was flat, professional distance replacing the warmth he'd grown to appreciate. "That's not how I meant it." "How did you mean it then?" She crossed her arms, waiting. The truth was, he didn't know how he'd meant it. In his world, money solved problems, bought services, made things happen. The idea of asking someone to do something without compensation felt foreign. "Then I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm not very good at this." "At what?" "Asking for help. Personal help." He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly feeling every one of his 46 years. "I spend all day negotiating deals worth millions of dollars, but I can't figure out how to ask someone to accompany me to a wedding without making it sound like a business transaction." The anger in her eyes softened slightly. "Maybe because that's how you see everything, as a transaction." "Maybe it is." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. Maybe that's why she left. Kayla sipped her coffee, studying him over the rim of her cup. "This wedding, it's important to you. I need to face it, face her, face what I lost and why I lost it." He met her gaze. "I can't do it alone." "Why me?" "Because you see me," he said simply. "Not my bank account or my company or my reputation. You see me and you're not impressed. It's refreshing." She laughed, but there was no mockery in it. "That might be the strangest compliment I've ever received. Will you consider it?" "Let me think about it," she said finally. "And Easton? If I say yes, it won't be because you're paying me." The next morning brought another surprise visit to grind coffee, though this time Easton wasn't entirely sure what he hoped to find. Kayla's promise to consider his request had left him in an unusual state of uncertainty, not about business projections or market trends, but about something far more personal and infinitely more important. She was training a new employee when he arrived, patiently demonstrating the proper way to steam milk while answering questions with the same genuine warmth she'd shown him. Watching her interact with others, he realized her kindness wasn't special treatment, it was simply who she was. "Give it another try, Marcus," she encouraged the young man struggling with the espresso machine. "Remember, consistency comes with practice." The irony of the employee's name wasn't lost on Easton, Marcus, like his business rival who'd stolen his fiancée. But this Marcus was barely 20, earnest and eager to please, nothing like the calculating corporate shark who dismantled Easton's personal life with surgical precision. "I'll be with you in just a minute," Kayla called to Easton, not looking away from her trainee. "Take your time." He found a corner table and settled in to wait, pulling out his phone to review emails. But instead of focusing on quarterly projections, he found himself watching Kayla work. She moved with economy and grace, turning the simple act of making coffee into something that resembled artistry. More importantly, she treated everyone, from the nervous student to the impatient businessman, with the same genuine respect. When had he stopped seeing people as individuals rather than obstacles or assets? "Honduras single origin?" she asked 20 minutes later, sliding into the chair across from him. "You brought it to me this time. Thought you might appreciate the service." Her smile was cautious, but present. "I've been thinking about your proposition." His chest tightened with unexpected nervousness. "And I have questions." "Shoot." "First, what exactly would this evening entail? I've never been to a Plaza Hotel wedding, but I'm guessing it's not the kind of event where I can wear my good jeans and call it formal." "Black tie." "Dinner, dancing, Probably some speeches that will feel longer than they actually are." He paused. "And yes, you'd need a formal dress. Don't say you'll pay for it." The warning was gentle but firm. "I was going to say I can give you the name of a good boutique. What you choose to spend is your business." "Better." She sipped her coffee, studying him. "Second question, what's the story? How did we meet? How long have we been dating? What do I need to know about your ex to avoid stepping on conversational landmines?" Her thoroughness impressed him. "We met here, in the coffee shop. We've been seeing each other for a few weeks. Nothing too serious yet, just getting to know each other." The lie felt strange on his tongue, partly because it didn't feel entirely false. As for Brittany, she's beautiful, ambitious, comes from pharmaceutical money. "She left me because she felt I prioritized work over our relationship." "Did you?" "Yes." The admission came easier this time. "I built an empire, but I lost everything that actually mattered." Something shifted in Kayla's expression, not pity, but understanding. "That's why you want to do this. Not to make her jealous, but to prove to yourself that you've changed." "Have I changed?" "That's what we're about to find out, isn't it?" She reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. "I'll do it." Relief flooded through him. "Thank you, but I have conditions. Name them. First, no money changes hands. This isn't employment. It's one person helping another through a difficult situation." "Agreed." "Second, we spend some time together before Saturday. If we're supposed to be dating, we should at least know basic things about each other. Favorite foods, family situations, that sort of thing." The request was reasonable, but it meant spending time with her outside their daily coffee encounters. The prospect was both appealing and terrifying. How much time?" "A few hours, maybe dinner tomorrow night, somewhere we can actually talk without interruption." "I know a place." "Not too fancy," she warned. "I want to be able to hear you speak, not perform for an audience of society photographers." He nodded, already mentally revising his first instinct to book the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan. Something quieter. "Third condition," her voice grew serious. "If this becomes too much for either of us, we call it off. No hard feelings, no obligations. Deal?" "Deal." He extended his hand across the table. "Partners?" She shook it, her grip firm and warm. "Partners." As Easton walked back to his office, he realized something had fundamentally shifted. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market dominance. He was looking forward to getting to know Kayla Stewart. The Italian restaurant Easton chose was a study in understated elegance, exposed brick walls, candle-lit tables, and an atmosphere that encouraged conversation rather than performance. When Kayla arrived, she looked nothing like the coffee shop employee he'd grown accustomed to seeing in casual clothes and an apron. She wore a simple black dress that somehow managed to be both elegant and approachable, her dark hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. The transformation was striking, but what caught his attention most was how comfortable she seemed in her own skin, regardless of the setting. "This is lovely," she said, as the hostess led them to a corner table. "Well, much better than those restaurants where the decor costs more than the food." "You speak from experience." A few unfortunate dates with men who thought expensive meant impressive. She accepted the wine menu from their server. "What about you? Do you always wine and dine potential wedding dates?" "You're my first fake girlfriend," he admitted, earning a laugh that drew appreciative glances from nearby tables. "I'm honored to be breaking new ground." She scanned the menu with genuine interest, rather than the calculating assessment he was used to seeing from dinner companions. "Tell me about your family. If we're supposed to be dating, I should know whether I'll be meeting anyone on Saturday. My parents live in Connecticut. Old money, older opinions. They'll probably be at the wedding, though we don't speak often." The familiar knot of tension formed in his stomach whenever he thought about his family. My father built the foundation of Reed Enterprises, but he never forgave me for expanding it beyond his vision. What was his vision? Conservative investments, steady returns, nothing too ambitious. Easton's voice carried years of frustration. He thought I was reckless for pursuing pharmaceutical research and development. Turns out I was right. We've developed 3 breakthrough medications in the past 5 years. But success didn't repair your relationship. Success rarely repairs anything personal. The observation came out more bitter than he'd intended. What about your family? Much simpler story. Middle-class parents from Ohio who think I'm crazy for living in New York, but they're proud of me anyway. Her smile was warm with genuine affection. My mom still sends care packages with homemade cookies, and my dad calls every Sunday to make sure I'm eating enough vegetables. Sounds nice. It is. Sometimes I take it for granted, having people who love you unconditionally, who worry about your happiness more than your achievements. The server appeared to take their orders, providing a brief respite from the unexpectedly personal turn their conversation had taken. When they were alone again, Kayla leaned forward, her eyes serious. Can I ask you something that might be too personal? After everything we've discussed, I don't think there are boundaries anymore. Do you miss her? Brittany? The question he'd been avoiding, even in his own thoughts. I miss the idea of her, the future we'd planned, the stability she represented. He chose his words carefully. But I'm not sure I ever really knew her, and I'm certain she didn't know me. What do you mean? She saw the successful businessman, the provider, the man who could give her the lifestyle she wanted, but she never saw the parts of me that didn't fit that image. The uncertainty, the loneliness, the fear that maybe success was all I had to offer. And what did you see when you looked at her? The perfect wife for a man in my position. Beautiful, well-connected, ambitious enough to understand my drive, but traditional enough not to compete with it. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. I proposed to her because she made sense on paper. That's not love. That's a merger. Maybe that's all I'm capable of. Kayla reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. I don't believe that. Why not? Because you're here, asking for help instead of trying to handle everything alone. Because you chose a small cafe over corporate catering. Because you're more interested in knowing about my family than impressing me with yours. Her thumb traced lightly across his knuckles. And because you look absolutely terrified right now, which means this matters to you. She was right, he was terrified. Not of the wedding, not of seeing Brittany, but of the possibility that this connection with Kayla might be real. That for the first time in his adult life, he might be feeling something that couldn't be quantified or controlled. Saturday's going to be interesting, he said finally. Are you ready for it? No. The honesty surprised him. But I think that's the point. Their food arrived, but the most important part of the evening had already been served. For the first time in years, Easton Reed was being seen, truly seen, by someone whose opinion mattered to him. And it terrified him in the best possible way. Friday afternoon found Easton standing outside Elegant Affairs, one of Manhattan's premier boutiques, feeling more nervous than he had before his first board presentation. Kayla had insisted on meeting him there rather than shopping alone, claiming she needed moral support when faced with price tags that exceeded her monthly rent. You sure about this place? She asked, studying the minimalist storefront with its single elegant dress displayed in the window. It looks like the kind of shop where they serve champagne and judge your credit score. They have excellent taste and discretion, both of which we'll need. The sales associate who greeted them was a woman in her 50s with the kind of understated sophistication that spoke of decades in high-end retail. Her eyes swept over Kayla with professional assessment, taking in everything from her posture to her skin tone. "Good afternoon, I'm Margaret. How may I assist you today?" "We need a gown for tomorrow evening," Easton said. "Black tie event at the plaza." Margaret's expression shifted into high gear. "Certainly. What's the occasion?" "Wedding," Kayla answered before Easton could speak. His ex-fiancée's wedding, to be precise. If Margaret was surprised by the blunt honesty, she didn't show it. "I see. In that case, we'll want something that makes a statement without being inappropriate for the venue." She turned to Kayla with renewed interest. "May I ask your size?" The next hour passed in a blur of silk, satin, and subtle intimidation tactics disguised as helpful suggestions. Kayla tried on dress after dress, while Easton sat in the designated partner chair, nursing espresso and trying not to think about how natural this felt, shopping with someone whose opinion he valued, whose happiness mattered to him. "What about this one?" Kayla emerged from the fitting room in a navy blue gown that hugged her curves before flowing into an elegant train. The color brought out the warmth in her brown eyes, and the cut was sophisticated without being overtly sensual. "It's beautiful," he said, and meant it, "but try the emerald one. The emerald costs more than my car. Try it anyway." The emerald dress transformed her. The deep green silk seemed to have been designed specifically for her coloring, and the way it moved when she walked was poetry in motion. When she looked at herself in the three-way mirror, her intake of breath was audible. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, indeed," Margaret murmured approvingly. "That's the one." Easton stood, moving to stand behind Kayla as she studied her reflection. "You look stunning." "I look like someone else?" "No," he said quietly, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Well, you look like yourself, just in a different setting." The moment stretched between them, charged with something that went beyond their fake dating arrangement. In the harsh boutique lighting, surrounded by luxury neither of them had asked for, something real was taking shape. "We'll take it," Kayla said suddenly. "Kayla, we'll take it," she repeated firmly. "And before you say anything about money, I'm buying it myself. I have savings, and this is important." Margaret discreetly retreated to handle the transaction details, leaving them alone in the fitting area. "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do." Kayla turned to face him directly. "If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it on my own terms. That dress makes me feel confident, beautiful, like I belong in your world for one night. That's worth the investment. My world isn't always kind to people like you. People like me. People who are genuine, who say what they mean and mean what they say." He reached out to touch her hand. Brittany's crowd can be challenging. "Are you trying to scare me off? Maybe I'm trying to prepare you. Or maybe you're trying to prepare yourself." Her smile was gentle but perceptive. "The Easton, what's the worst thing that could happen tomorrow night?" The question caught him off guard. "I'm not sure I follow. What are you really afraid of? That they'll judge me? That Brittany will think less of you for bringing someone like me? Or that you might actually enjoy yourself?" The last option hadn't occurred to him, but as soon as she said it, he realized she was right. He was afraid of enjoying himself, afraid of wanting something beyond the safe confines of his corporate empire. "All of the above," he admitted. "Well, then we'll just have to face all of the above together." She squeezed his hand. "Partners, remember?" Margaret returned with the dress carefully packaged and accessories to match. As they left the boutique, Easton realized the evening had shifted something fundamental between them. What had begun as a business arrangement was evolving into something far more dangerous, something that felt suspiciously like hope. Saturday evening descended over Manhattan with unseasonable warmth, as if the city itself was celebrating love and new beginnings. Easton stood in his penthouse apartment, adjusting his bow tie for the third time, and wondering when getting dressed had become such an ordeal. His reflection in the bedroom mirror showed a man who looked successful, confident, completely in control. The image was a lie. Beneath the perfectly tailored tuxedo, his heart was racing with an anxiety he hadn't felt since his first hostile takeover 15 years ago. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Reed, your car has arrived." "Thank you, James." "I'll be down in 5 minutes." 5 minutes to collect Kayla, 45 minutes to drive to the plaza, and then an entire evening of facing his past while pretending his feelings for his date were fabricated. The plan seemed significantly less brilliant than it had a week ago. The ride to Kayla's apartment building in Brooklyn gave him time to review their story one final time. They'd met at the coffee shop 6 weeks ago. They'd been on several dates. Nothing too serious yet, but promising. She worked in hospitality, close enough to the truth without getting into specifics about coffee shop ownership. Her building was a converted brownstone in Park Slope, the kind of neighborhood where young professionals planted roots before moving to Manhattan or the suburbs. He'd never spent time in this part of Brooklyn, and something about its tree-lined streets and lived-in charm appealed to him. Kayla was waiting in the lobby when he arrived, and the sight of her nearly stopped his heart. The emerald dress fit her like a second skin, transforming her from the approachable coffee shop owner into someone who belonged in the pages of Vogue. Her hair was swept up in an elegant updo that revealed the graceful line of her neck, and she carried herself with a confidence that made every other woman he'd ever dated pale in comparison. "Oh, you clean up pretty well yourself," she said, looking him over with approval. "Ready for this?" "Are you?" "Ask me tomorrow." She slipped her hand through his offered arm. "Tonight, I'm just going to focus on not tripping in these heels." The ride to the plaza passed in comfortable conversation about everything except the evening ahead. Kayla asked about his apartment, his work, his thoughts on the city's restaurant scene. Normal conversation, the kind two people might have on any date, and Easton found himself relaxing despite the circumstances. "Tell me about her," Kayla said as their car pulled up to the hotel's entrance. "What should I expect?" "Brittany's beautiful, charming when she wants to be, and very good at making other people feel inadequate." He watched the valet approach their door. "She'll probably try to corner you at some point to assess the competition." "Competition for what? You broke up 5 years ago. Competition for who moved on better. And what's your honest assessment?" Easton considered the question as he helped her from the car. "A week ago, I would have said she won by default. Tonight, I'm not so sure." The plaza's grand ballroom had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Thousands of white roses cascaded from crystal chandeliers, and soft lighting created an atmosphere of intimate elegance despite the room's impressive size. The guest list read like a who's who of Manhattan society, pharmaceutical industry leaders and old money families. "Breathe," Kayla whispered as they paused at the entrance. "I am breathing." "No, you're hyperventilating quietly." "There's a difference." She turned to face him, adjusting his boutonniere with gentle fingers. "We're going to walk in there. You're going to introduce me to a few people. We'll eat overpriced food and drink champagne, and then we'll go home. Simple. And if someone asks how we met, coffee shop, you were rude. I called you on it. Somehow you found that charming enough to ask me out." Her smile was mischievous. "It's not even entirely false. Ready." "Ready!" They stepped into the ballroom together, and Easton immediately felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning their way. He recognized faces from board meetings, charity galas, and country club events, all of them curious about his companion, all of them making rapid assessments and drawing conclusions. But for the first time in his adult life, he didn't care what they thought. All that mattered was the woman beside him, her hand warm and steady in his, her presence grounding him in a way he'd never experienced before. "Here goes nothing," he murmured. "Here goes everything," she corrected softly, and somehow that felt exactly right. The receiving line moved with the practiced efficiency of Manhattan society events, each guest exchanging pleasantries with the bride and groom before moving into the ballroom proper. Easton found himself studying Brittany from across the room as they waited their turn, noting how little she'd changed in 5 years. She was still breathtakingly beautiful in the calculated way that required teams of professionals and unlimited budgets. Her wedding dress was a masterpiece of French couture, and she wore it with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her own perfection. When she laughed at something Marcus said, the sound carried across the room like crystal chimes. "She's stunning," Kayla observed quietly. "Yes. You still love her?" The statement caught him off guard. "What makes you say that?" "The way you're looking at her, like you're trying to solve a puzzle you never quite figured out." Easton considered this, watching as Brittany gracefully accepted congratulations from a succession of well-wishers. "I think I love the memory of loving her. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense. Sometimes we hold on to how something felt rather than how it actually was." They reached the front of the line, and suddenly Brittany was before them, radiant in white silk and pearls. Her smile was polite perfection until her eyes found Easton's face. And something flickered there. Surprise, curiosity, perhaps a touch of satisfaction. "Easton," she said warmly, extending her hand. "I'm so glad you could make it. Congratulations, Brittany. You look beautiful." "Thank you." Her gaze shifted to Kayla, assessment immediate and thorough. "And you must be Easton's friend." "Kayla Stewart," Kayla said, extending her hand with genuine warmth. "Congratulations on your wedding. It's absolutely gorgeous." "Thank you. How do you and Easton know each other?" "We met at a coffee shop," Kayla replied easily. "He was trying to order black coffee like it was a hostile takeover." Brittany's laugh was genuine for the first time since they'd approached. "That sounds exactly like him, always approaching everything like a business transaction." "Not everything," Kayla said, slipping her hand into Easton's with easy affection. "He's been teaching me about wine. I've been teaching him about coffee. It's a fair trade." "How?" "Quaint." The word carried just enough edge to be insulting while maintaining plausible deniability. "Brittany," Marcus appeared at his bride's side, resplendent in his tuxedo and radiating the satisfaction of a man who'd won every prize he'd ever wanted. "Easton, good to see you." The handshake was firm, professional, completely lacking in warmth. Marcus Hartwell was everything Easton had never been. Charming, socially graceful, the kind of man who made friends as easily as breathing. He was also, Easton had to admit, genuinely handsome in a way that belonged on magazine covers. "Marcus, congratulations." The words came easier than expected. "This is Kayla Stewart." "Pleasure to meet you, Kayla." Marcus's attention was immediate and focused, the kind of charm that had made him legendary in their industry. "Are you enjoying New York?" "I live here, actually. Born and raised in Ohio, but the city's been home for several years now." "What brings you to New York?" "Coffee," she said with a straight face. "The pursuit of the perfect cup." "She owns a coffee shop," Easton added, surprising himself with the pride in his voice. "How entrepreneurial," Brittany said, and this time the condescension was unmistakable. "It must be nice to have such simple goals." The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Easton felt his jaw tighten, but Kayla's response was immediate and graceful. "Very simple," she agreed cheerfully. "I find there's something wonderful about creating a space where people can connect over something as basic as good coffee. It's honest work." The emphasis on honest was subtle but pointed, and Easton saw Marcus's eyes narrow slightly. The pharmaceutical industry had been rocked by several ethics scandals in recent years, and Marcus's company hadn't been entirely clean. "Well," Brittany said, her smile now sharp enough to cut glass, "how refreshing to meet someone so authentic, isn't it?" Kayla beamed, as if she'd received the highest compliment. "Easton says the same thing. He finds authenticity very attractive after spending so much time around people who aren't." The line behind them was growing restless, providing a natural end to the conversation. As they moved away from the receiving line, Easton felt something unexpected. Relief, not just at getting through the encounter, but at seeing Brittany and Marcus together and feeling nothing but distant curiosity. "That went well," Kayla said as they found their assigned table. "You enjoyed that? Maybe a little." Her grin was unrepentant. She started it. "Thank you." "For what?" "For defending me, for being exactly who you are." He pulled out her chair, his hand lingering on her shoulder longer than necessary. "For making me realize what I actually lost when she left." "What did you lose?" "My pride, but not my heart." The realization was liberating. "I don't think she ever had that." Dinner passed in a whirlwind of small talk, overpriced wine, and careful social navigation. Easton found himself watching Kayla interact with their table mates. A pharmaceutical executive and his wife, a federal judge, and two couples whose wealth came from old Manhattan real estate fortunes. She held her own beautifully, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that revealed both intelligence and genuine curiosity about their lives. So you actually own the coffee shop?" asked Patricia Whitman, the judge's wife, leaning forward with interest. "How fascinating. I don't think I've ever met an actual business owner before." "Well, co-owner," Kayla corrected. "I bought in as a partner earlier this year. It's small, but it's mine." "How did you manage the financing?" The question came from David Rothschild, the real estate heir, and carried genuine professional interest rather than condescension. "Savings, mostly. I worked 3 jobs for 2 years to accumulate the down payment, then took out a small business loan for the rest." Kayla's voice held quiet pride. "Nothing glamorous, just determination and a lot of 17-hour days." "Admirable," said the pharmaceutical executive. "But most young people these days expect success to be handed to them." Easton watched the conversation flow around him, marveling at how effortlessly Kayla had integrated herself into a world that should have been foreign to her. She wasn't trying to impress anyone or pretend to be something she wasn't. She was simply being herself, and somehow that was more compelling than any performance could have been. "Easton tells me you've been teaching him about coffee," Patricia continued. "I have to say, the idea of our pharmaceutical prince learning a trade is quite charming." "It's not really about the trade," Kayla said, glancing at him with something that looked remarkably like affection. "It's about slowing down enough to appreciate the process. Good coffee requires patience, attention to detail, respect for the ingredients." "Sound familiar?" The parallel to pharmaceutical research wasn't lost on anyone at the table, and Easton felt something warm unfurl in his chest at her subtle defense of his work. The band began playing as the dinner plates were cleared, and couples started making their way to the dance floor. Easton recognized the song, "The Way You Look Tonight," and felt a sudden surge of courage. "Dance with me," he said, standing and offering his hand. "And I should warn you, I'm not exactly ballroom trained." "Neither am I." The dance floor was crowded with couples who'd been attending events like this their entire lives, moving together with the kind of practiced elegance that came from country club lessons and cotillion balls. Easton pulled Kayla into his arms and discovered that technical skill mattered far less than simple connection. She fit against him perfectly, her hand warm in his, her body following his lead with natural grace. They moved together as if they'd been dancing for years, finding their rhythm without conscious thought. "You're full of surprises," she murmured, as he spun her gently. How so? This is nice, peaceful. I expected you to dance like you were negotiating a merger. Maybe I'm learning that not everything has to be a business transaction. Good student. The song shifted to something slower, more intimate, and other couples pressed closer together. Easton found himself doing the same, drawing Kayla near enough to catch the scent of her perfume, to feel the warmth of her breath against his neck. Easton. People are staring. He glanced around and realized she was right. They'd become the center of subtle attention, whispered conversations behind champagne glasses, and knowing looks exchanged between familiar faces. But instead of the mortification he'd expected, he felt only a mild annoyance at the intrusion. Let them stare. This wasn't part of the plan. What wasn't? This. She gestured vaguely between them. Whatever this is becoming. The honesty in her voice made him stop moving, though they remained in each other's arms. Around them, other couples continued their elegant circling, but Easton felt as if they were alone in the room. And what do you think it's becoming? Something real. The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. Something that scares the hell out of me. Me too. They stood motionless in the center of the dance floor, holding each other while the world spun around them. The song ended, and another began, but neither of them moved to separate. What do we do now? She asked. I have no idea, he admitted. I've never been here before. Where? Somewhere that matters more than money. Her smile was radiant. And then I guess we'll figure it out together. As the evening progressed, Easton became aware of something he hadn't anticipated. He couldn't stop looking at Kayla. Not in the calculating way he'd once studied merger documents or quarterly reports, but with a fascination that seemed to deepen with every moment they spent together. During the speeches, while the maid of honor recounted stories of Brittany's romantic journey, Easton found his attention drifting to the way Kayla listened, completely present, genuinely interested in these strangers' happiness. When Marcus's best man made a joke about corporate romance, she was the only person at their table who didn't glance meaningfully at Easton. You're staring, she whispered during a particularly long-winded toast about the merger of two pharmaceutical dynasties. Am I? Yes. And people are noticing. She was right. He caught Patricia Whitman watching them with undisguised curiosity, and across the room, he spotted several board members from competing companies observing their interaction with the kind of attention usually reserved for hostile takeover announcements. And maybe they're noticing because you're worth noticing, he said quietly. Easton, I mean it. He turned in his chair to face her fully, abandoning any pretense of listening to the speeches. You're the most interesting person in this room, and I can't figure out why everyone isn't staring at you. A soft blush colored her cheeks. You're going to blow our cover. What if I don't care about our cover anymore? The question hung between them as the speeches concluded and the band resumed playing. Around them, the evening continued its predictable trajectory. Dessert service, more dancing, the gradual exodus of older guests as the night grew later. But for Easton, everything else had faded into background noise. He watched Kayla taste the wedding cake and saw her eyes light up with genuine pleasure. He observed her conversation with a pharmaceutical researcher's wife about small business challenges and marveled at her ability to find common ground with anyone. When she excused herself to freshen up, he tracked her movement across the ballroom like a compass needle finding true north. She's lovely. The voice belonged to Eleanor Hartwell, Marcus's aunt and one of the pharmaceutical industry's most formidable matriarchs. She'd approached his table while Kayla was away, settling into the empty chair with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Eleanor, good evening. Good evening indeed. Her eyes followed his gaze toward the restroom corridor where Kayla had disappeared. Young woman, isn't she? Young enough to have fresh perspectives on things. I'm sure she does. Eleanor's smile was sharp. Jay, tell me, Easton, how serious is this relationship? The question was a probe, he realized, information gathering for the Manhattan Society network that thrived on gossip and social positioning. His answer would be dissected and analyzed, then distributed through back-channel conversations at country clubs and charity luncheons. Serious enough that I brought her tonight. Yes, to your ex-fiancé's wedding. Rather bold choice, or rather honest one. Eleanor studied him with the intensity of a woman who'd spent decades reading people and situations for competitive advantage. You've changed, Easton. 5 years ago, you would have come alone rather than risk showing weakness. Maybe I've learned the difference between weakness and strength. And which is this? Before he could answer, Kayla returned to the table, sliding gracefully into her chair with an apologetic smile. Sorry, there was a line. Did I miss anything interesting? Mrs. Hartwell was just commenting on what a lovely couple we make, Easton said smoothly. Oh. Kayla's attention shifted to Eleanor with polite interest. You must be so proud of Marcus tonight. The wedding is absolutely beautiful. Thank you, dear. And yes, I'm very proud. Marcus has always been exceptional at getting what he wants. The emphasis on getting wasn't lost on anyone. Well, tonight he certainly got the perfect wedding, Kayla replied easily. Brittany looks radiant, and they seem very happy together. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, perhaps surprised by the lack of jealousy or bitterness in Kayla's response. Indeed they do. Tell me, what do you think of our industry? Pharmaceuticals can be quite cutthroat. Any industry can be cutthroat if people choose to make it that way, Kayla said thoughtfully. But at its core, you're developing medicines that help people live better lives. That seems like meaningful work to me. The simplicity of her perspective seemed to catch Eleanor off guard. For a moment, the older woman's carefully maintained social mask slipped, revealing something like genuine surprise. Yes, Eleanor said slowly. It is meaningful work. Sometimes we forget that in all the competition and politics. As Eleanor moved on to circulate among other tables, Kayla turned to Easton with raised eyebrows. Was that a test? Probably. He reached for her hand across the table. How do you think you did? I think I reminded her why she got into this business in the first place. The evening was winding down when Marcus appeared at their table, slightly loosened by champagne and the satisfaction of a successful wedding reception. His approach carried the casual confidence of a man celebrating the best night of his life, but Easton detected something else beneath the surface. Curiosity, perhaps even challenge. Easton, mind if I steal you for a moment? Groom's prerogative. Marcus's smile was easy, but his eyes held the calculating look Easton remembered from their business dealings. Of course. Easton squeezed Kayla's hand. And I'll be right back. Take your time, she said, though something in her expression suggested she sensed the underlying tension. Marcus led him to a quieter corner of the ballroom, near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Central Park. The city sparkled below them, a reminder of the empire they'd both fought to control in different ways. Hell of a night, Marcus said, adjusting his bow tie. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. Wouldn't have missed it. Really? Marcus's eyebrows rose. Because 5 years ago, I thought you might actually try to stop the wedding. The admission caught Easton off guard. Stop it? Come on, Easton. We both know what happened wasn't exactly clean. Marcus sipped his champagne, studying Easton's reaction. I pursued a woman who was engaged to another man. In any other context, that would make me the villain. But she came to me. Brittany made her choice, and it wasn't you. Marcus's voice carried something that might have been regret. The question is, did she make the right choice? You're asking me that on your wedding night? I'm asking because looking at you tonight with her... Marcus nodded toward where Kayla sat chatting with another guest. You seem like a different man than the one Brittany left. Happier, more present. Easton followed Marcus's gaze to Kayla, who was listening intently to an elderly woman's story about her granddaughter's college adventures. Even from across the room, her genuine interest was visible, her whole body language indicating complete engagement with someone else's joy. Maybe I am different. Because of her. The question forced Easton to examine something he'd been avoiding all evening. Was he different because of Kayla? Or was Kayla simply the first person to see who he really was beneath the corporate armor? Maybe because of what she represents, Easton said carefully, which is the possibility that there's more to life than winning. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing this. You know, Brittany asked me about you earlier tonight. She wanted to know if I thought you were happy. And what did you tell her? That for the first time since I've known you, you look like you're not thinking about work. Marcus raised his glass in a small toast. Congratulations, by the way. For what? For moving on. For finding someone who makes you forget to check your phone every 5 minutes. Marcus's smile was genuine now, without the competitive edge that had always characterized their interactions. And for remembering that you're human. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two rivals who'd discovered they no longer needed to be enemies. The realization was liberating in a way Easton hadn't expected. Marcus, he said as they prepared to return to the reception, for what it's worth, I think Brittany made the right choice. You two belong together. And you belong with her, Marcus replied, nodding toward Kayla. Don't screw it up. When Easton returned to their table, he found Kayla in animated conversation with David Rothschild about urban development and the challenges facing small businesses in gentrifying neighborhoods. Her passion for the subject was evident, and David was clearly impressed by her insight. The key is maintaining community character while allowing for growth, she was saying. Too much preservation and you stagnate. Too much development and you lose what made the neighborhood special in the first place. Fascinating perspective, David said. Have you considered consulting? I know several development firms that could use someone with your understanding of community dynamics. That's very kind, but I'm happy where I am, Kayla replied. There's something to be said for being directly involved in your community rather than advising from the outside. Easton slid into his chair, struck once again by her authenticity. In a room full of people climbing social and professional ladders, she was content with her place in the world, secure in her choices without needing external validation. How was your conversation with the groom? She asked, as David excused himself to find his wife. Enlightening, Easton said. He told me I look happy. Do you feel happy? The question was simple, but it cut straight to the heart of everything that had changed in the past week. When was the last time someone had asked him about his happiness rather than his success? Yes, he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I feel happy. Her smile was radiant. Good. You should feel happy more often. I'm beginning to think that might be possible. The wedding reception was reaching its natural conclusion when Brittany appeared at their table, resplendent in her second dress of the evening, a flowing creation designed for dancing that somehow managed to be even more stunning than her ceremony gown. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd never doubted her own magnetism, drawing appreciative glances from every corner of the ballroom. Easton, I was hoping we could have a moment, she said, her voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that had always made refusing her nearly impossible. If you don't mind, Kayla. Of course not, Kayla replied, though Easton caught the slight tension in her voice. I'll go refresh my drink. Easton started to protest, but Kayla was already moving away from the table with elegant efficiency. leaving him alone with the woman who dominated his thoughts for far longer than he cared to admit. "You look wonderful tonight," Brittany said, settling into Kayla's vacant chair with practiced grace. "Marriage suits you." "I'm not married." "Not yet." Her smile was knowing, almost smug. "But you're thinking about it, aren't you?" "I can see it in how you look at her." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. He had been thinking about it, not consciously, but in the way he noticed how Kayla's laugh made him want to hear it again, how her presence made even mundane conversations feel significant. "Brittany, she's lovely, truly," Brittany continued, her tone carrying just enough condescension to sting. "Very authentic, very real." "Exactly what you need, I suppose. What I need. Someone uncomplicated. Someone who won't challenge you or push you to be more than you are." Brittany's fingers traced the rim of her champagne glass. "Someone safe." The words hit their target with surgical precision. "Is that what you think? That I chose someone who won't challenge me? Didn't you?" Brittany leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to the intimate tone he remembered from their most private conversations. "She's sweet, Easton, but she's not your equal. Not intellectually, not professionally, certainly not socially. She's exactly what a man chooses when he's tired of fighting for something better." Heat flared in Easton's chest. Anger, but also something deeper and more protective. "You don't know anything about her." "I know enough. I know she owns a coffee shop, lives in Brooklyn, and probably thinks the stock exchange is something that happens at Christmas." Brittany's laugh was silver bright and cutting. "I know you brought her here to make me jealous, and I know it's working." "What?" "Oh, Easton." Her voice carried pity now, which was somehow worse than condescension. "Did you really think I couldn't see through this charade? You've been watching me all evening, studying my reactions, waiting to see if I'd regret my choice." The accusation stung because it carried an uncomfortable grain of truth. He had been watching her, comparing her responses to Kayla's natural warmth, measuring his own reactions against the feelings he'd once thought were love. "And what did you conclude?" he asked quietly. "That you're still the same man I left 5 years ago. Still trying to win through strategy rather than authentic feeling." Brittany's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine sadness. "You brought her here as a prop, Easton. A beautiful, sweet prop to help you navigate an uncomfortable evening. But you don't love her. How would you know? Because if you loved her, really loved her, you would have walked away from tonight rather than subject her to this circus." Brittany reached across the table and touched his hand. "You would have chosen her comfort over your need to prove a point to me." The words hit him like a physical blow because he recognized the truth in them. He had brought Kayla here for his own purposes, used her kindness and warmth as armor against his own insecurities. The realization made him feel smaller than he had in years. "I should go," he said, starting to rise. "Easton, wait." Brittany's voice stopped him. "I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to save you from making the same mistake I did." "What mistake?" "Settling for someone who makes you feel safe instead of someone who makes you feel alive." Her eyes found Marcus across the room, and her expression transformed with unmistakable love. "I chose you because you were successful, stable, everything I thought I wanted. But I left you for him because he saw parts of me I'd forgotten existed. And you think I'm doing the same thing? I think you're terrified of being alone, so you're clinging to the first woman who showed you genuine kindness." Brittany stood, smoothing her dress. "But she deserves better than being your safe harbor. And you deserve better than settling for easy love." She leaned down and kissed his cheek gently. "Don't waste another 5 years of your life, Easton. Either love her completely or let her go." As Brittany glided away to rejoin her husband, Easton sat alone at the table, her words echoing in his mind with devastating clarity. Kayla returned to find Easton staring out the ballroom windows, his expression distant and troubled. The easy warmth that had characterized their entire evening had vanished, replaced by the kind of corporate mask she'd learned to recognize during their coffee shop encounters. "Everything all right?" she asked, settling back into her chair with careful grace. "Fine." The word came out clipped, professional. Nothing like the man who'd been looking at her with such genuine affection just minutes before. "Easton." Her voice carried a gentle warning. "What did she say to you?" "Nothing important." He turned back to face her, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers. "Are you ready to leave?" "I think we've made our appearance." The dismissal stung more than she'd expected. All evening, she'd felt like they were building something real together, discovering a connection that transcended their original arrangement. Now he was looking at her like she was exactly what she'd agreed to be, hired companionship for an uncomfortable social obligation. "Of course," she said quietly. "Let me just get my wrap." The ride back to Brooklyn passed in strained silence. Easton stared out his window at the city lights while Kayla studied her hands in her lap, trying to process the sudden shift in his demeanor. She replayed their entire evening, searching for signs she'd missed, moments where she'd overstepped or misread the situation. "Thank you," he said finally, as their car pulled up outside her building. "For tonight, you were—" He paused, seemingly searching for words. "You were exactly what I needed." The phrase hit her wrong. Too polite, too distant, too much like a business transaction being concluded. "You're welcome. I'll call you," he said, but even he seemed to know it was a lie. "No, you won't." The words came out steadier than she felt. "And that's okay. This was always temporary." She let herself out of the car before he could respond, climbing the steps to her building without looking back. Only when she was safely inside her apartment did she allow herself to acknowledge how much the evening's ending had hurt. In her bathroom mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. The emerald dress that had made her feel beautiful now seemed like a costume, and her carefully styled hair felt like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. She'd allowed herself to believe, for just a few hours, that she could belong in Easton's world. Brittany's words from earlier in the evening came back to her. How refreshing to meet someone so authentic. The comment had seemed like an insult then, but now Kayla wondered if it had actually been a warning. A reminder that authenticity and sophistication rarely occupied the same space in Manhattan society. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment her heart leaped, thinking it might be Easton. Instead, it was her mother. "How was the fancy wedding, honey?" "Did you have fun playing Cinderella?" The innocent question brought tears to her eyes. Playing Cinderella, that's exactly what she'd been doing. And like all fairy tales, it had to end at midnight. She changed out of the emerald dress carefully, hanging it in her closet where it looked ridiculously out of place among her practical work clothes and casual weekend wear. Tomorrow, she'd return to her real life, the coffee shop, her regular customers, the comfortable routine of a world where she actually belonged. But as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the memory of how it felt to dance with Easton, how his eyes had followed her movements throughout the evening, how he'd defended her work to their tablemates with obvious pride. Those moments had felt genuine, real in a way that transcended any arrangement they'd made. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe she'd confused gratitude with affection, professional admiration with personal interest. Maybe Brittany had seen exactly what Kayla had been too naive to recognize, that she was useful to Easton, convenient, but ultimately not someone he'd choose if he weren't trying to prove a point to his ex-fiancée. The realization was humbling and painful. She'd allowed herself to develop real feelings for a man who saw her as a solution to a temporary problem, She'd mistaken his appreciation for her authenticity as attraction, his gratitude for her assistance as genuine care. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd go back to being just Kayla from the coffee shop. Tonight had been beautiful, magical even, but it wasn't real life. Real life was serving coffee to people who saw her as part of the scenery, not as someone worthy of their serious attention. She'd gotten carried away by the fairy tale, but fairy tales weren't meant for people like her. They were entertainment for people like Brittany, beautiful, polished women who could move between worlds without ever questioning whether they belonged. Kayla closed her eyes and tried to forget how right it had felt to be in Easton's arms. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable rain, turning Manhattan streets into rivers of grey water and matching Kayla's mood perfectly. She'd spent Sunday replaying every moment of Saturday night, analyzing each conversation and gesture until she'd convinced herself that whatever she'd thought was developing between her and Easton had been entirely one-sided. The coffee shop felt smaller than usual, cramped and mundane after the grandeur of the Plaza Hotel. She went through her opening routine mechanically, grinding beans, checking equipment, arranging pastries, while trying to shake the feeling that she was settling back into a life that had become too small for her somehow. "You look terrible," Marcus observed when he arrived for his morning shift. Not the billionaire Marcus from Saturday night, but her young employee who was still learning the difference between espresso and coffee. "Thanks for the pep talk." "No, I mean it. You look like someone who had a really good time and now feels guilty about it." He tied his apron with the awkward fumbling of someone still new to the job. "What happened at that fancy wedding?" "Nothing happened. That's the point." The morning rush provided welcome distraction from her thoughts. Regular customers ordered their usual drinks, complained about the weather, and discussed their weekend plans with the comfortable familiarity of neighborhood ritual. This was her world, genuine, unpretentious, real. She'd been foolish to think she wanted anything else. At 10:30, the bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see Easton standing in the entrance, his expensive suit slightly damp from the rain. He looked as uncomfortable as she felt, scanning the cafe with the kind of careful assessment she remembered from their first meeting. "Honduras, single origin?" she asked when he approached the counter, keeping her voice professionally neutral. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk." "We're pretty busy," she lied, gesturing to the mostly empty cafe. "Kayla." His voice carried a note of pleading that surprised her. "Please." Against her better judgment, she nodded toward the corner table where they'd had their first real conversation. "Marcus, can you handle the counter for a few minutes?" They settled across from each other in the mismatched chairs, and Kayla was struck by how different this felt from Saturday night. Here, in her territory, she could see clearly how little they actually had in common. He looked like what he was, a billionaire pharmaceutical executive slumming in Brooklyn. She felt like what she was, a small business owner who'd gotten in over her head. "About Saturday night," he began. "You don't need to explain anything. We had an arrangement. We fulfilled it. End of story. It's not that simple, isn't it?" She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, using the warmth to steady herself. "You needed a date? I provided one. You helped me feel like Cinderella for a night. I helped you get through seeing your ex get married. Everyone got what they wanted." "What did you want, Kayla?" The question caught her off guard. What had she wanted? To feel beautiful, to belong in a world of luxury and sophistication, to be chosen by someone like him. "It doesn't matter what I wanted," she said finally. What matters is what's realistic." "And what's realistic?" "This." She gestured around the cafe. "My life. My actual life. Not some fantasy where I get to play dress up in designer gowns and dance at the Plaza Hotel." Easton leaned forward, his expression intense. What if it doesn't have to be fantasy? What if what doesn't have to be fantasy? Us! This thing between us. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Kayla felt her heart skip, then forced herself to remember Brittany's casual cruelty, the way the other guests had assessed and dismissed her, the obvious gap between their worlds. There is no us, Easton. There's you, and there's me, and we exist in completely different universes that happen to intersect for one evening. That's not true, isn't it? She stood, suddenly needing distance from the intensity in his eyes. You're worth $3 billion. I co-own a coffee shop in Brooklyn. You live in a penthouse. I live in a one-bedroom apartment with a broken air conditioner. You wear suits that cost more than my monthly rent. I consider it a good month when I can afford to go to a movie. None of that matters. All of that matters. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. Because at the end of the day, when the fairy tale is over, you go back to your world and I go back to mine. And your world doesn't have room for people like me, except as temporary entertainment. Kayla, I have to get back to work. She walked away before he could respond, leaving him sitting alone at the corner table like just another customer who'd outstayed his welcome. Easton sat in the corner of Grind Coffee for another 10 minutes, watching Kayla work behind the counter with determined focus. She moved efficiently between customers, her smile bright and genuine for everyone except him. When she finally looked in his direction, her expression was politely distant, the look she might give any customer who'd lingered too long over a single cup of coffee. He understood the message. Their time was over. The walk back to his office felt longer than usual, though the rain had stopped and Manhattan streets had returned to their normal rhythm of controlled chaos. By the time he reached the 40th floor, he'd almost convinced himself that Kayla was right, that Saturday night had been a brief intersection of two incompatible worlds, nothing more. Mr. Reed. Miranda appeared in his doorway with a stack of contracts and the kind of cautious expression she wore when delivering unwelcome news. The Morrison deal hit a snag. Their board wants to renegotiate the licensing terms. Of course they do. He settled behind his desk, grateful for the familiar problems that required analytical thinking rather than emotional processing. Schedule a conference call for this afternoon and get me the original research data on their compound trials. Already pulled in on your desk. Miranda paused. Also, your brother called. Something about lunch this week. Tell him I'm busy. You always say you're busy. Because I'm always busy. Miranda's expression suggested she had opinions about this response, but she simply nodded and retreated to her desk. Easton buried himself in contract reviews and market analyses, letting the familiar rhythm of corporate problem-solving wash away the complications of his personal life. By noon, he'd resolved the Morrison licensing issue, approved 3 new research proposals, and scheduled meetings for the rest of the week. His assistant had ordered lunch from his usual restaurant, and the quarterly reports were spread across his desk in neat stacks of financial data. This was his real life. This made sense. Numbers didn't lie or create impossible expectations or make him question everything he'd built. His phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Dinner tonight? Jen's making that pasta thing you actually eat." Easton stared at the message for a long moment. When was the last time he'd had dinner at his brother's house? When was the last time he'd done anything that didn't directly relate to Reed Enterprises? Can't. Working. You're always working. When's the last time you had a real conversation with another human being? The question hit uncomfortably close to home. His last real conversation had been with Kayla, sitting in this same cafe where she'd just effectively ended whatever had been developing between them. I have real conversations all day. Business conversations don't count. I mean personal stuff, life stuff. My life is my business. That's the problem. Easton set his phone aside without responding and returned to his quarterly projections. But Jake's words echoed in his mind, mixing uncomfortably with Brittany's observations from Saturday night and Kayla's dismissal that morning. Was his life really so narrow that work was the only genuine connection he could maintain? Had he become so focused on building an empire that he'd forgotten how to be a person? The afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and conference calls, but underneath the familiar routine, something felt different, wrong. Like a machine that was running efficiently, but had somehow slipped out of alignment. At 6 o'clock, when his staff began filtering out to their real lives, families, hobbies, relationships that existed beyond corporate hierarchies, Easton remained at his desk, staring at financial reports that seemed less compelling than usual. His computer screen reflected his face in its dark surface when he finally closed the last file. 46 years old, $3 billion in net worth, one of the most successful pharmaceutical executives in the country, and completely alone in a glass tower, surrounded by the monuments to his professional achievements. The realization wasn't new, but it felt sharper tonight, more urgent, like a deadline he'd been ignoring for too long. His phone rang, the landline, which meant it was either an emergency or someone who knew him well enough to bypass his usual screening methods. Easton Reed. "You missed dinner." Jake's voice carried disappointment and concern in equal measure. "Jen made extra food, thinking you might actually show up for once." "I told you I was working." "You always tell me you're working." "The question is whether you ever stop." Easton looked around his empty office, at the city lights beginning to twinkle beyond his windows, at the quiet that settled over the building when the human element disappeared for the day. "Maybe I don't know how to stop anymore." The admission surprised them both. "Maybe it's time to learn," Jake said gently. Before you forget why you started building all this in the first place?" After hanging up, Easton sat alone in his empire of glass and steel, wondering when success had started feeling so much like failure. 2 weeks passed in a blur of aggressive productivity that felt more like punishment than progress. Easton threw himself into work with the kind of ruthless focus that had built his empire, closing deals and expanding market share with mechanical efficiency. The Morrison acquisition went through ahead of schedule. 3 new research partnerships were signed. Stock prices climbed steadily upward. On paper, Reed Enterprises was having its best quarter in 5 years. In reality, Easton felt like he was drowning in his own success. "Oh, the Johannesburg facility is reporting 30% ahead of projected yields," Miranda announced during their Monday morning briefing, reading from a tablet while Easton stared out his office windows. "The new malaria treatment trials are exceeding all expectations." "Good." The word came out flat, automatic. "The board wants to schedule a celebration dinner. Something about recognizing your leadership during this growth period." "Cancel it." "Sir, cancel it." "I don't need a dinner to celebrate numbers on a spreadsheet." Miranda's expression suggested she wanted to say something about his increasingly antisocial behavior, but she simply made a note on her tablet. "Should I reschedule for next month?" "No." Easton turned from the window to face her. "Miranda, how long have you worked for me?" 7 years this October." "Have you ever seen me take a vacation?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "A real vacation?" "No, sir. You've attended conferences, business retreats, that sort of thing. But an actual vacation where you don't check email or take calls? Never." "When was the last time I left this building before 8 p.m.? She paused, clearly thinking, "I honestly can't remember." The admission hung between them like an indictment, 7 years of working together, and his assistant couldn't recall a single instance of him prioritizing anything over work. "That's pathetic." "Sir!" "Nothing. What's next on the schedule?" The day proceeded with its usual parade of meetings and decisions, but Easton found himself distracted in ways that were becoming increasingly problematic. During a presentation about expanding their European operations, he caught himself wondering what Kayla was doing. While reviewing clinical trial data for a new cardiac medication, he thought about her laugh and the way she'd made even mundane conversation feel significant. By 5 o'clock, he'd made a decision that surprised him. "I'm leaving early," he announced to Miranda's obvious shock. "Early? It's 5 o'clock. You never leave before—" "Before 8 or 9, I know." He gathered his coat, feeling strangely rebellious. "I'm going for a walk." "A walk?" "To clear my head." Revolutionary concept. The elevator ride to the lobby felt like an escape from prison. Outside, Manhattan's early evening energy was infectious. People heading home from work, meeting friends for drinks, living lives that extended beyond office buildings and quarterly projections. He found himself walking toward Brooklyn, though he told himself it was just for the exercise. The pedestrian path across the Brooklyn Bridge offered spectacular views of the city skyline. And for the first time in weeks, Easton felt something approaching peace. The walk took an hour, long enough for him to acknowledge what he'd been trying to ignore. He missed Kayla, not just her presence, but the way she'd made him feel like a person worth knowing rather than a company worth courting. Grind coffee came into view before he'd consciously decided to seek it out. Through the large front windows, he could see the familiar interior, mismatched furniture, local artwork, the warm lighting that had always felt like sanctuary from Manhattan's aggressive sophistication. Kayla was behind the counter, training someone new on the espresso machine with the same patient attention she'd shown Marcus. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she looked more beautiful than any woman in designer clothes at any charity gala he'd ever attended. He stood on the sidewalk for 10 minutes, watching her work and trying to convince himself to either go inside or walk away. In the end, he did neither. Just stood there like a stalker until she happened to glance toward the window and their eyes met through the glass. Her expression shifted from surprise to something harder to read. Not anger exactly, but wariness. She said something to her trainee and moved to the window. But she didn't gesture for him to come inside. Instead, she just looked at him with the kind of sad understanding that was somehow worse than anger would have been. After a moment, she shook her head slightly, not in rejection, but in resignation, and returned to her work. The message was clear. Whatever they'd had was over, and standing outside her cafe wasn't going to change that. Easton walked home through Brooklyn's tree-lined streets, feeling more alone than he had in his entire adult life. Success, he was learning, was a cold companion when it was all you had left. The crisis came on a Thursday morning in the form of a phone call that would reshape everything Easton thought he understood about success and failure. He was reviewing acquisition targets when Miranda's voice crackled through the intercom with unusual urgency. "Mr. Reed, Dr. Patricia Chen from the FDA is on line 1. She says it's urgent regarding the Neuraxin trials." Neuraxin was Reed Enterprises' most promising development, a breakthrough medication for early-stage Alzheimer's that represented 3 years of research and nearly $200 million in development costs. The FDA approval was supposed to be a formality, the final step before bringing the treatment to market. "Dr. Chen," Easton said, picking up the call, "I wasn't expecting to hear from you until next week. Mr. Reed, I'm calling to inform you that we're suspending the Neuraxin approval process pending further investigation." The words hit him like a physical blow. Suspending? On what grounds? "We've received reports of adverse reactions in the extended trials. Severe reactions that weren't disclosed in your initial submissions." Dr. Chen's voice was professionally neutral, but Easton detected the kind of careful distance that preceded bad news. "We need to see all research data, including any studies that weren't included in your application. Dr. Chen, I can assure you that all relevant data was submitted." "Mr. Reed, we have documentation suggesting otherwise. I strongly recommend you review your files thoroughly before our meeting next week." The call ended, leaving Easton staring at his phone with growing dread. Neuraxin was supposed to be his crowning achievement, a medication that could genuinely improve millions of lives while generating enormous profits for the company. The idea that there were undisclosed adverse reactions was impossible. Unless it wasn't. He spent the next 4 hours buried in research files, following paper trails and cross-referencing reports with growing horror. The truth, when he found it, was worse than he'd feared. Buried in supplementary data from the European trials were reports of severe cognitive decline in 12% of test subjects, side effects that had been noted but somehow omitted from the FDA submission. The omission wasn't criminal, but it was damning. Someone in his organization had made an editorial decision about which data to include, prioritizing approval speed over complete transparency, the kind of aggressive business practice that Easton had rewarded in the past. "Get me Dr. Harrison," he told Miranda when she appeared in his doorway with afternoon coffee, "and pull all the Neuraxin files from the European division. Dr. Harrison, Reed Enterprises, head of research, arrived within an hour looking like a man facing execution. He confirmed what Easton had already discovered. The adverse reaction data had been classified as preliminary and excluded from the FDA submission on the recommendation of their legal team. The lawyers said it wasn't technically required disclosure since the reactions only occurred in 12% of subjects," Harrison explained, his voice tight with stress. "They argued that all medications have side effects, and 12% was within acceptable parameters. Acceptable parameters for what? For destroying people's cognitive function? The reactions were temporary in most cases." "Most cases?" Easton's voice rose dangerously. "What about the others?" Harrison's silence was answer enough. The implications crashed over Easton like a tsunami. Not only would Neuraxin be denied approval, but the FDA investigation could trigger congressional hearings, media scrutiny, and potential criminal charges. Reed Enterprises, stock would crater. Other medications under review would face increased scrutiny. Years of careful reputation building would crumble overnight. But worse than the financial implications was the moral reality. His company had hidden data about a medication that could cause permanent cognitive damage. They'd prioritized profits over patient safety, and he was ultimately responsible. By evening, he was alone in his office again, surrounded by legal documents and research reports that painted an increasingly damning picture. His phone had been ringing constantly. Board members, investors, journalists who'd somehow gotten wind of the FDA investigation. He'd built his empire on the principle that success justified almost any means. Now, facing the collapse of everything he'd worked for, he finally understood the cost of that philosophy. The irony wasn't lost on him. For weeks, he'd been missing Kayla, remembering her authenticity and genuine concern for others. Now he was facing the consequences of building a company culture that valued results over integrity. Exactly the kind of moral compromise she would have found intolerable. His reflection in the office window showed a man who'd won every business battle and lost every fight that actually mattered. He'd chosen success over love, profits over principles, empire over connection. And now, as his empire began to crumble, he was facing the truth Kayla had tried to show him, that all the money in the world couldn't buy back the parts of himself he'd sold to get it. The news broke on Friday morning with the kind of media blitz that destroys reputations in real time. Pharmaceutical giant accused of hiding Alzheimer's drug risks screamed across the front page of the Wall Street Journal, while CNN ran a banner headline about Reed Enterprises under federal investigation. Easton's phone had been ringing since 5 a.m. Reporters, board members, and investors all demanding answers he didn't have. By 9 o'clock, Reed Enterprises stock had lost 40% of its value, and trading was temporarily suspended pending further information about the FDA investigation. "The board wants an emergency meeting," Miranda announced, setting his morning coffee on the desk with shaking hands. "And there are protesters outside the building." Through his office windows, Easton could see the growing crowd on the sidewalk below, families holding signs with pictures of loved ones affected by Alzheimer's, advocacy groups demanding transparency in drug trials, reporters setting up cameras for what promised to be a media circus. "Mr. Reed," Dr. Harrison appeared in the doorway, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "The FDA wants to meet this afternoon. They're bringing a full investigation team." "How bad is it, Richard?" "Worse than we thought. The European data shows cognitive decline persisted in 8% of subjects even after discontinuing the medication. We're talking about permanent damage to people who volunteered for these trials, believing they were helping develop a cure." The weight of that reality settled over Easton like lead. These weren't numbers on a spreadsheet or acceptable losses in a business strategy. They were real people whose lives had been damaged by his company's pursuit of profit. The board meeting convened at noon in the glass-walled conference room that had witnessed so many of his victories. Today, the atmosphere was funereal. Board members who'd celebrated his aggressive leadership style now looked at him with the kind of caution reserved for toxic assets. "The situation is untenable," announced Margaret Blackstone, the board's longest-serving member. "Between the FDA investigation, the media coverage, and the stock collapse, we are facing an existential crisis." "What are you suggesting?" Easton asked, though he already knew. "We need to consider new leadership. Someone without direct involvement in the Neuraxin development who can rebuild investor confidence." "You're asking me to resign. We're asking you to consider what's best for the company you built." Margaret's voice carried genuine sadness. "The board has tremendous respect for your achievements, Easton, but this scandal could destroy everything if we don't act decisively." The room fell silent, except for the distant sound of protesters chanting outside. Easton looked around the table at people he'd worked with for years, allies who'd supported his vision and profited from his success. Now they were prepared to sacrifice him to save themselves. He understood their logic. It was exactly the kind of ruthless calculation he would have made in their position. "I need time to think," he said finally. "Of course. But Easton, we need a decision by Monday." The afternoon FDA meeting was a professional catastrophe. Dr. Chen and her team presented evidence of systematic data omission that went back 3 years, affecting multiple drug trials beyond Neuraxin. The agency was considering criminal referrals to the Department of Justice and immediate suspension of Reed Enterprises. Ability to conduct human trials? By 6 o'clock, when the last lawyer and investigator had left his office, Easton sat alone in the empire he'd spent 20 years building, watching it crumble in real time. His computer screen showed Reed Enterprises' stock price in freefall. His phone displayed dozens of missed calls from reporters, and outside his windows, protesters continued their vigil demanding accountability. He thought about calling his brother, reaching out to someone who might offer comfort or perspective. But what could he say? That his relentless pursuit of success had finally caught up with him. that the company culture he'd created had prioritized results over ethics until the inevitable collapse. Instead, he found himself thinking about Kayla, not with romantic nostalgia, but with something approaching shame. She'd seen through his corporate facade to the man underneath, the person who'd traded his integrity for market dominance, his humanity for quarterly profits. She'd represented everything he'd forgotten how to value: authenticity, genuine connection, the simple satisfaction of work that actually helped people. And he'd let her walk away because admitting he needed those things would have required acknowledging how empty his success really was. Now, facing the ruins of everything he'd built, he finally understood what he'd lost when he chose his empire over the possibility of real love. The price of winning, he realized, was becoming someone not worth knowing. Saturday night found Easton alone in his penthouse apartment, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that suddenly felt like monuments to his failures. The limestone countertops, Italian leather furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, all of it acquired during his relentless climb to the top of an industry that was now rejecting him. The evening news had led with Reed Enterprises, featuring interviews with families affected by the Neuraxin trials. He'd watched a woman named Sarah Morrison describe her husband's rapid cognitive decline after participating in the European trials, her voice breaking as she explained how a man who'd once been a brilliant engineer could no longer remember their children's names. "We trusted them," she'd said, looking directly into the camera. "We believed we were helping develop a cure for other families like ours. Instead, they stole the last good months we might have had together." Easton had turned off the television but couldn't escape her words. They echoed in his mind as he wandered through rooms filled with expensive objects that provided no comfort, no connection to anything meaningful. His phone sat silent on the kitchen counter. No calls from friends, because he didn't have any. No messages from family, because he'd isolated himself from them years ago. No texts from romantic interests, because he'd never allowed anyone close enough to matter. The apartment felt like a museum of a life unlived. Awards and accolades lined his office walls, documenting professional achievements that now seemed meaningless. Photos from charity galas and industry events showed him shaking hands with politicians and celebrities, but the smiles looked forced, the connections superficial. When had he become this person? When had success become a substitute for satisfaction? Wealth a replacement for worth? He found himself standing in his walk-in closet, staring at rows of identical suits that had served as armor against the world. Each one cost more than most people made in a month, yet they'd failed to protect him from the one thing he'd feared most, being truly known and found wanting. The memory of dancing with Kayla hit him with unexpected force. She'd fit perfectly in his arms, moving with natural grace while wearing a dress that cost less than his shoes. But more than that, she'd looked at him like he was worth knowing. Not his bank account or his company, but him. The man underneath the corporate facade. How long had it been since anyone had seen him that way? His laptop sat open on the bedroom dresser, still displaying news articles about the Reed Enterprises scandal. He scrolled through comment sections where strangers debated his character, his company's ethics, his fitness to lead. The anonymity of the internet had unleashed a torrent of judgment, but what stung most were the comments that weren't entirely wrong. Another rich CEO who forgot that real people get hurt by corporate greed. This is what happens when you prioritize shareholders over patience. He built an empire on other people's suffering. The words cut deep because they contained uncomfortable truths. He had prioritized profits over people, results over relationships, success over substance. The cognitive dissonance he'd maintained for years, telling himself he was helping people while making decisions based purely on financial metrics, had finally collapsed. At midnight, he called his brother. The phone rang 4 times before Jake's groggy voice answered. "Easton, Jesus, it's midnight. Are you okay?" "No." The honesty surprised them both. "I'm not okay." "Hold on." Easton heard rustling, whispered conversation with Jake's wife. Footsteps. "Okay, I'm in the kitchen. Talk to me. I think I've destroyed everything that actually matters." "You mean the company?" "I mean my life." Easton's voice cracked slightly. "The company was supposed to be my legacy, but it's just another machine that hurts people. And I'm so focused on building it that I've forgotten how to be human." "Easton." "There was this woman, Kayla. She reminded me what it felt like to be a person instead of a corporation. But I was so terrified of admitting I needed her, that I let her walk away." "It's not too late, isn't it? Look at what I've become, Jake. Look at what my company has done. Why would someone like her want anything to do with me?" "Because maybe the man she saw is still in there somewhere. Maybe he just got buried under 20 years of thinking that success was the same thing as happiness." The conversation lasted another hour, covering territory they hadn't explored since they were children. Fears, regrets, the dreams they'd abandoned in pursuit of more practical goals. When it ended, Easton felt empty but oddly cleansed, like he'd finally acknowledged truths he'd been avoiding for decades. As dawn broke over Manhattan, he made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week ago. He was going to resign from Reed Enterprises, and then he was going to try to become someone worth knowing again. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after hitting absolute bottom. Easton stood in his office one final time, looking out at the city that had been both his proving ground and his prison, preparing to walk away from everything he'd spent his adult life building. The resignation letter sat on his desk. 3 paragraphs that would end his 20-year tenure as CEO of Reed Enterprises. He'd written it in the pre-dawn hours, each word carefully chosen to accept responsibility without admitting legal liability. A final piece of corporate choreography in a career defined by strategic communication. "The board is assembled," Miranda announced from the doorway. She'd been unusually quiet all morning, perhaps sensing the magnitude of what was about to unfold. "Thank you, Miranda, for everything. You've been far more than an assistant. You've been the one constant in a career that consumed everything else." Her eyes widened with understanding. "You're really doing this. I should have done it years ago." The boardroom felt different as he entered, smaller somehow, less impressive than the temple of power he'd once believed it to be. The faces around the table showed various degrees of anticipation, resignation, and barely concealed relief. They knew what was coming. "I've made my decision," he said without preamble, placing copies of his resignation letter in front of each board member. "Effective immediately, I'm stepping down as CEO and resigning from the board of directors." The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Margaret Blackstone spoke. "Easton, you built this company. Are you certain this is what you want?" "What I want is irrelevant. What I want is to stop the hemorrhaging before Reed Enterprises becomes synonymous with corporate malfeasance." He remained standing, feeling strangely liberated by the finality of his decision. The FDA investigation will continue, but new leadership gives the company its best chance at survival. "What will you do?" asked David Chen, the newest board member. "I don't know." The admission felt revolutionary. "And then, for the first time in 20 years, I honestly don't know what comes next." The transition meeting lasted 3 hours, covering everything from succession planning to damage control strategies. Easton found himself oddly detached from discussions about the company's future, like he was observing someone else's life being dissected and reorganized. By noon, news of his resignation had leaked to the financial press. Reed Enterprises. Stock rallied slightly on the announcement, a final confirmation that his departure was being celebrated by the market he'd spent decades trying to impress. He cleaned out his office methodically, packing 20 years of awards and mementos into boxes that would be shipped to his apartment. The personal items fit into a single cardboard box, a telling indictment of how little personal life he'd maintained during his corporate ascent. As he waited for the elevator, Miranda approached with an envelope. "What's this?" "Your severance documentation. The board was very generous, considering." She paused, clearly wanting to say more. "Speak freely. You've earned that right." "You're doing the right thing," she said quietly. "Not just for the company, but for yourself. I've watched you for 7 years, and you've never looked more relieved than you do right now." The observation was accurate in a way that surprised him. Despite facing professional ruin and public disgrace, he felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of maintaining an empire built on compromises had been lifted from his shoulders. Outside Reed Enterprises for the last time, Easton stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the building that had defined his identity for 2 decades. Protesters had been replaced by financial reporters interviewing industry analysts about the pharmaceutical sector's ethics crisis. His phone buzzed with interview requests from news organizations eager to secure the first post-resignation statement from the fallen CEO. He deleted them all without reading past the subject lines. Instead, he found himself walking toward Brooklyn, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe because it represented the opposite of everything he was leaving behind, authentic instead of artificial, community-focused instead of profit-driven, real instead of strategic. The walk took 2 hours, giving him time to process the magnitude of what he'd done. By the time he reached Park Slope, the afternoon was warm and inviting, and he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of becoming someone he could actually respect. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in his adult life, that uncertainty felt like freedom rather than failure. 3 weeks after resigning from Reed Enterprises, Easton found himself standing outside Grind Coffee at 7 in the morning, holding 2 cups of coffee from a competitor down the street and feeling more nervous than he had before any board presentation in his career. He'd spent those 3 weeks in a kind of exile, learning how to exist without the constant demands of corporate leadership. The silence had been deafening at first. No urgent phone calls, no crisis meetings, no quarterly projections demanding his attention, but gradually the quiet had become peaceful rather than oppressive. He'd read books for pleasure for the first time in years. He'd walked through neighborhoods he'd never explored, despite living in Manhattan for decades. He'd had long conversations with his brother about everything except business, and every day he'd thought about Kayla. Not with the desperate longing of someone trying to recapture a fantasy, but with the steady certainty of someone who'd finally understood what he'd lost and why it mattered. The coffee shop looked different in the early morning light, warmer somehow, more substantial than the quaint neighborhood business he'd once dismissed as charming but ultimately insignificant. Through the windows, he could see Kayla opening for the day, moving through her routine with the kind of purposeful efficiency he recognized from his own work habits. The bell chimed as he entered, and she looked up from the espresso machine with surprise that quickly shifted to wariness. "We're not open yet," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I know. I brought coffee." He held up the cups from her competitor. "Oh, thought you might want to try the enemy's product?" Despite herself, she almost smiled. "Industrial coffee from a chain store. You're either making a joke or you've completely lost your mind." "Maybe both." He approached the counter slowly, giving her space to retreat if she wanted. "Can we talk just for a few minutes?" "Easton, we've been through this." "I resigned." The words stopped her mid-sentence. She stared at him with a mixture of shock and confusion, as if he'd announced he'd grown wings and learned to fly. "You what?" "I resigned from Reed Enterprises 3 weeks ago. It's been all over the financial news." He set the coffee cups on the counter between them. "I thought you might have heard. I don't read the financial news." She was studying his face as if looking for signs of deception. "Why would you resign? That company is your entire life." That was the problem. Kayla moved around the counter to flip the sign to open, though they both knew she wasn't expecting customers for another hour. The familiar routine seemed to give her time to process his announcement. What happened? Everything fell apart. The FDA investigation, the stock collapse, the board demanding my resignation. He leaned against the counter, feeling strangely relieved to be confessing his professional downfall to someone who might actually understand its significance. Turns out, building an empire on questionable ethics isn't sustainable. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was the best thing that could have happened to me." "How can you say that?" "Because losing everything I thought I wanted forced me to figure out what I actually need." He met her eyes directly. "I need to be someone worth knowing again. Someone you might consider getting to know." She was quiet for a long moment, processing not just his words, but the way he'd said them. Without the corporate polish she remembered, without the carefully calculated charm he'd once wielded like a weapon. "You look different," she said finally. "I feel different." "How?" "Smaller. In a good way." He gestured around the coffee shop. "This place used to seem quaint to me, charming but unimportant. Now I think it might be the most honest business I've ever encountered." "What do you want, Easton?" The question he'd been expecting, the one he'd rehearsed a dozen different ways during his morning walks. But now, facing her directly, all his prepared speeches seemed inadequate. "I want to apologize for using you to prove a point to my ex-fiancée. I want to apologize for treating our connection like a business transaction. And I want to ask if there's any chance you'd be willing to let me try again." "Try what again?" "Getting to know each other. Without the pretense, without the performance, without me trying to fit you into my old life." He paused, gathering courage for the most important words he'd ever spoken. "I want to try building something real with you. If you're willing to take that risk with someone who's finally learning the difference between success and happiness." Kayla stared at him for what felt like forever, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "I'll think about it." It wasn't yes, but it wasn't no. For a man who'd just lost everything, it felt like hope. Kayla called him 2 days later, her voice careful but not cold, when she suggested they meet for dinner, not at an expensive restaurant, but at a small Thai place in her neighborhood where they could actually hear each other speak. "I've been reading about Reed Enterprises," she said, after they'd ordered, her hands wrapped around a cup of jasmine tea. "The FDA investigation sounds serious." "It is serious. The company will survive, but it'll take years to rebuild trust." Easton found himself oddly comfortable discussing his professional downfall with her. "The worst part isn't the financial losses. It's knowing that real people were hurt by decisions I made or allowed others to make. How are you handling that?" "Badly, but honestly." He met her eyes across the small table. "For 20 years, I convinced myself that aggressive business practices were just part of the game. That if we didn't push ethical boundaries, our competitors would beat us to market and everyone would suffer. Did you believe that? I told myself I did, but I think I just got addicted to winning, and ethical considerations became obstacles rather than guideposts." Their food arrived, providing a brief respite from the intensity of the conversation. "What about you? How have the past few weeks been?" "Confusing." She stirred her pad thai thoughtfully. And after the wedding, I convinced myself that what happened between us was just fantasy. Cinderella getting carried away by one night of playing dress-up. But I couldn't stop thinking about the way you looked at me when we were dancing. Not like I was useful or convenient, but like I mattered. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Then I read about your resignation, and I realized maybe what I felt wasn't one-sided after all. It definitely wasn't one-sided. So why did you let me walk away? The question he'd been asking himself for weeks. Because I was terrified that if you really knew me, saw how empty my life was, how I'd traded everything meaningful for corporate success, you'd realize you were right about us being from different worlds. And now I think maybe the problem wasn't that we were from different worlds. Maybe the problem was that I was living in the wrong world entirely. Kayla studied him with the same perceptive intensity he remembered from their first coffee shop conversations. What does that mean, practically speaking? You can't just decide to become a different person overnight. No, but you can decide to stop being the wrong person. Easton set down his fork, focusing entirely on her. I spent 3 weeks asking myself what I actually want from life, not what I think I should want or what would impress other people. And what did you discover? That I want to do work that actually helps people instead of just generating profits. I want relationships based on genuine connection rather than mutual benefit. I want to build something meaningful instead of just something successful. He paused. And I want to build it with someone who reminds me that authenticity is more valuable than achievement. That's a lot of pressure to put on another person. You're right. I'm not asking you to fix me or complete me or any of that romantic comedy nonsense. I'm asking if you'd be interested in exploring what we might build together as two complete people who happen to bring out the best in each other. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of honest conversation settling between them. Around them, the restaurant's gentle bustle provided a soundtrack of normalcy, families sharing meals, couples on dates, friends catching up over familiar food. I have conditions, Kayla said finally. Name them. First, no more pretense. If we do this, we do it as ourselves, not as the people we think the other person wants us to be. Agreed. Second, we take it slow. Really slow. I need to trust that this version of you is real and sustainable, not just a reaction to losing your company. That's fair. Third, she hesitated, then seemed to gather her courage. I need to know what you're planning to do with your life. I can't invest in someone who's still figuring out basic questions about who they want to be. I've been thinking about that. Easton felt his heart rate increase as he prepared to share an idea that had been forming during his long walks through the city. What would you say if I told you I wanted to invest in community-focused businesses? Places like your coffee shop that actually serve their neighborhoods rather than just extracting profit from them. I'd say that sounds like someone I might want to get to know better. Her smile was cautious but genuine, and for the first time in weeks, Easton felt like the future might hold something worth anticipating. Over the next month, Easton began what he privately called Operation Authenticity, a systematic effort to prove to both Kayla and himself that his transformation was real and sustainable, not just a reaction to professional crisis. He started by volunteering at a community health clinic in Queens, using his pharmaceutical industry knowledge to help review medication protocols and insurance coverage issues. The work paid nothing and required him to take 3 subway transfers from Manhattan, but it connected him to the actual human impact of healthcare decisions in ways his corporate boardroom never had. "You're different," observed Dr. Maria Santos, the clinic's director, after his 3rd week of volunteer work. "Most pharmaceutical executives who come through here are doing community service for court-ordered reasons or tax write-offs. You actually seem to care about the patients." I'm learning that caring about outcomes is more satisfying than caring about income, Easton replied, reviewing a file for a patient who couldn't afford the diabetes medication his former company manufactured. The volunteer work led to other connections, community organizations, small business advocacy groups, neighborhood development councils. For the first time in his career, Easton found himself in rooms where success was measured by lives improved rather than profits generated. He also began what he thought of as Kayla time, regular visits to grind coffee that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with understanding how a genuinely community-focused business operated. "Adu, you don't have to keep coming in here every day," she said one afternoon as he helped her move a heavy shipment of coffee beans from the delivery truck. "I believe that you've changed." "I'm not just coming for you," he admitted, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I'm trying to learn how to run a business that actually serves people instead of just using them." "And what have you learned?" "That profit isn't evil, but prioritizing it above everything else is." He gestured around the cafe, which was bustling with afternoon customers, students studying, professionals having informal meetings, neighbors catching up over lattes. "This place makes money, but money isn't why it exists." "Why does it exist?" "Because you believe coffee should bring people together rather than just caffeinate them individually." The observation was accurate enough to make her pause in her inventory, counting, "You've been paying attention to everything, the way you remember customers' names and orders. How you've created a space where a college student can sit for hours over a single cup of coffee without feeling guilty. The fact that you know which of your regulars are going through divorces or job losses and you check on them without making it obvious. That's just good business. No, that's good humanity. Good business would be maximizing table turnover and upselling expensive menu items." Their conversations during these visits gradually shifted from cautious friendship to something deeper. Kayla began sharing her own dreams, expanding the coffee shop's community programming, offering business mentorship to other aspiring entrepreneurs, creating a model that other neighborhoods could replicate. Have you ever thought about franchising?" Easton asked one evening as she locked up the shop. "With what capital? And besides, franchising usually means losing the community focus that makes this place special. What if there was a way to expand the model without losing the mission?" She stopped walking and turned to face him. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that I have access to capital and business expertise, and you have a proven model for community-centered entrepreneurship." He felt his heart rate increase as he approached the idea he'd been developing for weeks. "What if we partnered to help other people open similar businesses in underserved neighborhoods? Coffee shops, community kitchens, small-scale groceries, businesses that serve neighborhoods instead of just extracting money from them." The words came faster as his excitement grew. "We could provide funding, training, ongoing support. Create a network of businesses that prioritize community impact alongside financial sustainability." Kayla stared at him with an expression he couldn't read. "Adish, you're talking about walking away from pharmaceutical money to invest in coffee shops. I'm talking about using pharmaceutical money to build something that actually improves people's daily lives. That's either incredibly noble or completely insane. Maybe both." He stepped closer, encouraged by the fact that she hadn't immediately dismissed the idea. "But it would be meaningful work. The kind of thing we could both be proud of building together. If you're interested, if you think someone like me could learn to value community over conquest." Her smile was slow but genuine. "I think someone like you already has." The partnership began officially on a Thursday morning in November, when Easton signed over 40% of his Reed Enterprises severance package to establish the Community Capital Fund. The legal documents were straightforward, but the emotional significance was profound. He was literally investing his corporate past in a radically different future. "You sure about this?" Kayla asked as they sat in the lawyer's office, reviewing contracts that would formalize their business relationship. "This is more money than most people see in a lifetime." "I've never been more sure of anything." Easton signed the final page with a flourish. "Besides, what's the point of having money if you don't use it for something that matters?" Their first investment was in Marcus, not the pharmaceutical CEO, but Kayla's young employee who'd been dreaming of opening a neighborhood bakery in the Bronx. With community capital funding and Kayla's mentorship, Marcus transformed a vacant storefront into a thriving business that served both excellent pastries and as an informal community center. "This is what success actually looks like," Easton said 6 weeks later, watching Marcus teach a bread-making class to local teenagers while customers lined up for Saturday morning croissants. "Different from pharmaceutical board meetings," Kayla teased. "Completely different, better." He pulled her closer as they stood outside the bakery, observing the controlled chaos of a small business serving its community. "Everyone here is getting something they actually need." The success of Marcus's bakery led to other investments: a community kitchen in Queens, a small grocery cooperative in Brooklyn, a childcare center in the Bronx that doubled as a job training program for unemployed parents. Each project required different skills and presented unique challenges, but all shared the same underlying philosophy. Profit was important, but purpose was essential. Working together revealed sides of both their personalities that hadn't emerged during their earlier romantic courtship. Kayla was more ambitious than he'd realized, with a strategic mind that complemented her community focus. Easton discovered he was more patient than he'd believed, capable of investing time and attention in projects that would take years to fully mature. "We're good at this," Kayla observed one evening as they reviewed applications for their 6th round of funding. They'd established a routine of working late at the coffee shop, spreading documents across tables, while the cafe's evening ambiance provided a comfortable backdrop for business planning. "We are," Easton looked up from a proposal for an urban farm project, "better than I expected, because we balance each other out. You bring the business expertise, I bring the community knowledge. That's not the only reason." He set down his papers and focused entirely on her. "We're good at this because we both care about the same things now. We want to build something that actually improves people's lives." The observation hung between them, acknowledging something that had been developing quietly over months of working closely together. Their partnership had evolved from professional collaboration to genuine friendship, to something deeper and more sustainable than the passionate attraction they'd felt at Brittany's wedding. "Easton," she said softly, "I think I'm falling in love with you." "No, I know I'm falling in love with you." She reached across the table to touch his hand. "Not with your money or your connections or your reformed bad boy appeal. With you. The person who spends Saturday mornings teaching small business accounting to community entrepreneurs. The man who remembers every detail of every project we've funded. The guy who's figured out that helping others succeed is more satisfying than dominating competitors." "Good," he said, lifting her hand to his lips. "Because I've been completely in love with you since the night we danced at the plaza. I just needed to become someone worthy of that feeling. You were always worthy. You just needed to believe it yourself." They kissed across the table, littered with business plans and funding proposals, surrounded by the evidence of what they'd built together, not just a successful social impact fund, but a relationship based on shared values rather than mutual need. "So what now?" she asked when they broke apart. "Now we keep building." "The fund, the community projects, this thing between us." He gestured around the coffee shop that had become their unofficial headquarters. "All of it. Together. Together." Outside, Brooklyn's evening rhythm continued around them. People heading home from work, stopping by for coffee, meeting friends for dinner. The ordinary magic of community life that had become the foundation of everything they were creating. For the first time in his adult life, Easton felt like he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do, with exactly the right person beside him. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities they would explore together. 1 year later, Easton stood in the kitchen of their newest venture, a community cafe and commercial kitchen space in Lower Manhattan that served as both a neighborhood gathering place and a training facility for aspiring food entrepreneurs. Sunlight streamed through large windows onto reclaimed wood tables where customers worked on laptops, families shared breakfast, and small business owners pitched ideas to potential collaborators. "Order up," called Maria, one of their program graduates who'd gone from unemployment to running her own catering business in 8 months. 2 lattes and a breakfast sandwich for table 6. Easton carried the order to a corner table where a young couple was deep in conversation about their plans to open a community bookstore. 6 months ago, he would have dismissed their venture as economically unrealistic. Now he found himself calculating how the Community Capital Fund might help them navigate the challenges of independent retail. "You're thinking about funding them, aren't you?" Kayla appeared beside him, carrying a tray of freshly baked pastries from their on-site bakery program. "Maybe. Good bookstores are like good coffee shops. They create community spaces that can't be replicated by chains or online ordering." Listen to you, talking about community spaces like a true convert. "I've had a good teacher." He slipped his arm around her waist, a gesture that had become natural over months of working side by side. Besides, someone has to make sure you don't fund every project that tugs at your heartstrings. My heartstrings have excellent judgment. The morning rush brought its usual mix of neighborhood regulars and curious visitors who'd heard about their community-focused business model. Easton found himself genuinely enjoying the customer interactions, learning names, remembering orders, becoming part of the daily rhythm that made neighborhoods feel like home. "Mr. Reed?" A voice behind him belonged to Dr. Patricia Chen from the FDA. "I thought that was you." Easton turned, surprised to see the woman who'd overseen the investigation that ended his pharmaceutical career. "Dr. Chen, this is unexpected. I was in the neighborhood and heard about this place. Quite a career change from pharmaceutical development." "Quite a life change," he corrected. "Dr. Chen, I'd like you to meet Kayla Stewart, my business partner." "And fiancée," Kayla added with a smile, displaying the simple platinum ring they'd chosen together, elegant but unpretentious, like everything else they'd built. "Congratulations." Dr. Chen's expression was genuinely warm. "I have to say, Mr. Reed, when I read about your new ventures in the business press, I wasn't sure what to expect. But this," she gestured around the bustling cafe, "this is impressive. You're actually helping people." "We're trying to," Easton replied. "It turns out there are better ways to improve lives than developing medications people can't afford." "Indeed there are." Dr. Chen accepted a coffee from Kayla with obvious appreciation. "The pharmaceutical industry could learn something from what you're doing here." After she left, Easton found himself reflecting on the conversation. A year ago, seeing Dr. Chen would have triggered anxiety about legal consequences and professional reputation. Today, her approval felt good but not essential, validation from someone whose opinion he respected, but not the kind of external validation he'd once desperately craved. "Your penny for your thoughts," Kayla said during a brief lull in the afternoon crowd, just thinking about how different everything is. He looked around their cafe, taking in the genuine community they'd helped create. "This time last year, I was alone in a corporate office, making decisions that affected thousands of people I'd never meet. Now I'm serving coffee to neighbors whose names I know, helping them build businesses that improve their lives directly. Any regrets? About losing Reed Enterprises? No, about waiting so long to figure out what actually matters, every day. He pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side. But I can't regret the path that led me to you. Even if it took a fake date to your ex-fiance's wedding. Especially that. Best-worst idea I ever had. As evening approached, they worked together to close the cafe, cleaning tables, counting the day's receipts, preparing for tomorrow's service. The routine was comfortable, satisfying in ways that corporate board meetings had never been. Walking home through Brooklyn's tree-lined streets, Easton reflected on the transformation of the past year. He'd lost an empire but gained a life, traded professional dominance for personal satisfaction, exchanged the isolation of success for the connection of meaningful work. Most importantly, he'd found someone who loved him not for what he'd achieved, but for who he'd chosen to become. At 47, Easton Reed had finally learned the difference between winning and succeeding, and he'd discovered that the best victories were the ones you shared. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.